The night was restless. The wind carried whispers from the void, curling around the skeletal branches of blackwood forest like ghostly fingers. A storm brooded over the land, but the true tempest lurked beneath the trees. Rail sensed them before they arrived. His breath was slow, controlled, but his muscles were wound-tight as a predator's before the strike. He stood at the edge of the forest, bare feet pressing into the damp earth, golden eyes gleaming in the moonlight. The scent drifted toward him first, cold as winter's breath, yet laced with something forbidden. It was unlike anything he had ever known. A scent that whispered of death yet sang of desire. Vampires. He should have left, turned back, fled before their poison could sink into his veins. But the pull was too strong. The beast within him stirred, its hunger tangled with something more dangerous than thirst, curiosity. Then he saw them. 3 figures moving through the mist, untouched by the weight of mortal existence. Their presence bent the air around them, shadows flowing like silk in their wake. But it was the one in the center that held him captive. Celine. Her beauty was carved from the night itself, her skin a pale echo of the moon, her lips the color of fallen petals. Silver hair cascaded down her back, each strand glistening like frost kissed by starlight. Her eyes, cold and knowing, locked onto his, assessing, searching. A gaze that should have been lethal, and yet it was fire. Something primal awakened in him. A growl rumbled deep in his chest, low and warning. She did not flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her bare feet gliding over the leaves without a sound. Closer now, close enough that he could hear the ghost of her breath, could feel the phantom touch of her presence against his skin. "You are not afraid." Her voice was silk over steel, smooth yet edged with danger. Rail's lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. "I don't fear creatures who have no heartbeat." She tilted her head, amusement flickering behind her eyes. "And yet, your heart races." His pulse was betraying him, hammering beneath his ribs like a war drum, not from fear. No, something darker, something that called to the beast inside him, the part of him that wanted to chase, to claim, to ruin. Celine reached out, fingers like the first touch of winter against his skin. Not warmth, but something more intoxicating. A paradox, a curse. "You are dangerous," she murmured. "And you," he growled, closing the space between them, towering over her, "are playing with fire." Her lips parted just slightly, enough to let the ghost of a smile form. "Perhaps I like the burn." The air between them grew thick, charged with something neither of them should have entertained. He could hear her sisters watching, their presence a distant echo compared to the force that pulled him toward her. She was a storm wrapped in the illusion of stillness, a predator disguised as poetry. And he was the beast who should have devoured her. Instead, he found himself drowning. A gust of wind howled through the forest, breaking the moment, whispering his warning. But it was too late. The choice had already been made. He would either destroy her, or she would be his ruin. The forest pulsed with unseen energy, the scent of damp earth and distant rain heavy in the air. Beneath the canopy, shadows stretched long and restless, whispering secrets only the night could hear. Somewhere in the darkness, a beast prowled, unseen but ever watchful. Rail had been waiting for her. His breath came slow, measured, but his body was taut with unspoken hunger. He told himself it was instinct, the call of predator to prey. But that was a lie. This pull, this madness, had nothing to do with the hunt. It was something darker, something he could neither control nor resist. And then she appeared. Celine moved through the trees as if they bent to her will, her silver hair glowing in the moonlight. She was weightless, ethereal, untouched by the burdens of the mortal world, but she was no fragile thing. Beneath the elegance lay something fierce, something ancient and untamed. She was staring at him now, her eyes catching the glow of the moon, reflecting it like mirrors of liquid silver. She was beautiful in a way that made the night itself seem dull, beautiful in a way that made even a beast like him forget what he was. Still watching from the shadows, she murmured. Rail stepped forward, slow, deliberate. The ground trembled beneath his weight. Still tempting fate. A ghost of a smile played on her lips. Perhaps fate enjoys being tempted. His jaw tightened. She was playing with fire, and they both knew it. He was cursed, bound to the moon's pull, barely able to contain the beast within. And she was everything he should destroy. But he couldn't stay away. She moved closer, unafraid. The scent of her was intoxicating, cool like midnight rain, yet laced with something forbidden. The moment stretched between them, thick with words unspoken, desires unacknowledged. She reached out, brushing her fingers along his jaw. Feed the light, teasing. A spark shot through him, fierce and consuming. He was fire, she was ice, and yet they melted into something neither could name. You burn, she whispered, tracing the edge of his throat. And you, his voice was rough, low, are too close. But he didn't pull away. Her touch was deliberate, dangerous, a test, a provocation. She could feel the tension in him, the way his body strained to hold back something primal. He was a storm barely contained, a force of nature waiting to break. And still, she pressed closer. Do I frighten you, wolf? Her words were soft, but they held the sharpness of a blade. Rael's golden eyes darkened, his breath unsteady. You should be the one afraid. Afraid. She exhaled the word like a secret, her lips a breath away from his. And yet, here I stand. He growled, low and deep, the sound vibrating through the space between them. His hands clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms. Every instinct in him screamed to take, to claim, to erase the distance between them. And then she did the unthinkable. She leaned in, her lips grazing the edge of his jaw, a touch so fleeting it could have been a dream. But it wasn't. His restraint snapped. In a blutter he moved, one hand gripping her wrist, the other pressing into the curve of her waist. Not rough, not gentle, possessive, warning. A reminder that she was playing with something that could devour her whole. She didn't resist. She only smiled, slow and knowing. The storm had already begun, and neither of them would escape unscathed. The wind howled through Blackwood Forest, twisting through the trees like a restless spirit. The night was alive, thrumming with unseen energy, with something ancient and electric that crackled in the air like a storm waiting to break. Rael stood in the shadows, golden eyes locked on the figure before him. Celine. She moved like a whisper of moonlight, untouched by the weight of the world. Her silver hair shimmered, cascading over her shoulders like a river of frost, and her eyes, those merciless, knowing eyes, held him captive. She was not meant for this earth. She was a specter, a goddess, something neither living nor dead. And yet she was here, flesh and bone, real. Too real. You've been following me, she murmured, tilting her head, amusement curling at the edges of her lips. Rael took a slow step forward. And you've been letting me. The space between them was thin, stretched tight like a thread that could snap at the slightest pull. He could feel the cold of her presence against his skin, could hear the whisper of her breath in the silence. Every instinct in him screamed to stay away, to break this unspoken game before it shattered them both. But he was past the point of retreat. Celine's fingers trailed along the bark of a nearby tree, slow, deliberate. Tell me, wolf, she said, voice like velvet, do you hunt me, or do you crave something else? His jaw tensed. The beast inside him rumbled in response, primal and restless. He had spent years mastering control, keeping his curse from ruling him. But she unraveled him with a single glance. I crave nothing, he lied. She stepped closer, her presence a ghostly touch against his skin. Liar. The word coiled between them, daring, taunting. She was toying with something she didn't understand, or maybe she understood all too well. His hand shot out, fingers curling around her wrist, not hard, not gentle, a warning. Her pulse, if she had one, remained steady, unafraid. Her free hand rose, barely grazing his collarbone, tracing the heat of his skin with a touch so light it was maddening. You're warm, she whispered, as if the thought fascinated her. Like fire. And you, he murmured, voice rough, are cold as death. Perhaps that's why you can't seem to stay away. Her lips hovered near his throat, not quite touching, but close enough that he felt the promise in the space between them. It wasn't hunger. It was something else, something far more dangerous than thirst or blood. His grip on her tightened. You're playing with something you don't understand. She exhaled a soft laugh, her breath cool against his skin. And you, she whispered, pressing closer, are afraid to let it consume you. A growl rumbled in his chest, deep and low, vibrating through the stillness. He should have pulled away. He should have ended this before it began. But her presence was a spell, a curse woven into his very bones. And God's help him. He didn't want to break free. Celine tilted her head, eyes searching his face as if she could read the war raging inside him. Then, slowly, deliberately, she leaned in, her lips brushing just beneath his jaw, a fleeting, taunting touch, vanishing as quickly as it came. Fire roared through his veins. With a sharp inhale, he pulled her closer, their bodies a breath apart, his grip firm, possessive. You don't know what you're asking for, he growled, voice thick with restraint. She smiled against his skin, unshaken, unbroken. Then show me. The night swallowed them whole, the forest bearing witness to a storm neither of them could escape. The night was thick with silence, the kind that came before a storm. A heavy stillness that pressed into the earth, waiting, watching. Rael knew he should have left. He should have walked away, torn himself from the madness creeping into his bones. But the moment he looked at her, truly looked, he knew there was no escape. Celine stood beneath the hollow arch of the trees, her silver hair rippling like liquid moonlight, her gaze steady, unreadable. The stars had woven themselves into her presence, casting her in an otherworldly glow. She was beautiful in a way that defied logic, that stripped men of reason and left them lost in the abyss of her existence. She had ruined him, and she knew it. Tell me, Wolf, she murmured, stepping closer, her voice like the hush of midnight. Why do you fight this? Rael's breath was slow, measured, but his pulse betrayed him, thudding like a war drum beneath his skin. He clenched his jaw, golden eyes locked onto hers. Because I know what happens if I don't. Celine tilted her head, amusement flickering in the depths of her gaze. And what is that? He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because he would not speak of the fire that coiled in his veins, of the hunger that was not for flesh or blood, but something far more consuming. He would not speak of the way his beast stirred, not to destroy, but to claim. She moved again, deliberate and slow, her presence ghosting against his senses. I wonder, she mused, her fingers brushing along his collarbone, light as a whisper. Do you fear me, Rael? A growl rumbled deep in his chest, low, dangerous. His hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist, firm, unyielding. I fear what you make me want. The confession hung between them, thick as smoke, impossible to take back. Celine's lips curved, not quite a smile, but something more knowing, more devastating. And what is that? She breathed. His grip tightened. Her pulse, if she had one, did not falter. She was ice, untouched, untamed. But the way she looked at him, the way her gaze searched his face like a secret waiting to be unraveled, told him the truth she would not speak. She was burning too. He moved without thought, closing the space between them in a single breath. The world shrank to nothing, leaving only her, the scent of frost and something forbidden, the cool brush of her skin against the heat of his. A shudder ran through her, too subtle for anyone else to see, but he felt it. And God's help him, he wanted more. Celine, his voice was rough, barely human. She lifted her gaze, lips parting, a breath away from surrender. His control wavered, fraying at the edges, slipping into something reckless, something raw. He wanted to test the limits of her stillness, to see if she could remain untouched when the fire between them threatened to consume them both. His fingers traced the line of her throat, slow, deliberate. Her skin was cool beneath his touch, a cruel contrast to the inferno raging within him. She exhaled softly, the smallest sound, but it sent a dark satisfaction curling through his chest. She was not immune. She was breaking too. His lips hovered near the shell of her ear, his breath warm against her skin. You should have stayed away, he whispered. Her fingers curled against his chest, not pushing away, but pulling him closer. And yet, she murmured, voice laced with danger, neither of us did. The storm had long since passed the point of no return, and the fire between them was only beginning to rise. The night had grown darker, thick with an unnatural stillness. The wind had ceased to whisper through the trees, the creatures of the forest retreating into silence as if the earth itself held its breath. Only the moon remained, silver and watchful, casting pale light over the figures lost in the shadows. Rael's pulse was steady, but everything inside him was fraying at the edges. He stood like a beast on the verge of losing himself, his body taut, the fire in his veins threatening to consume him. He had spent years mastering control, chaining the wilderness within him. But she was undoing him with every passing second. Celine. She stood before him, her presence an intoxicating contradiction, cold as death, yet burning with something unspoken, something that set his blood ablaze. Her silver eyes held his, searching, daring. Her beauty was otherworldly, dangerous, the kind that lured men to ruin with a single glance, and he was no exception. He should have left her in the darkness. But she had stepped into his world, and now there was no escape. "I feel your hunger," she murmured, her voice smooth as silk, laced with knowing. Rael exhaled slowly, his hands clenching at his sides. "You mistake it for weakness." Celine's lips curved, a ghost of amusement playing at the edges. "No," she whispered, stepping closer, her presence a whisper against his skin. "I mistake it for restraint." A growl rumbled in his chest, deep and low, vibrating through the space between them. She was playing a dangerous game, teasing the fire that burned just beneath his skin. Did she understand what she was provoking, or was she testing the limits of her own control? She reached for him, her fingers light as a breath as they traced along the curve of his jaw. He tensed at the touch, his breath sharp, his body warring between resistance and surrender. Celine's voice dropped to a whisper. "I wonder," she mused, tilting her head, "what happens when a beast stops holding back?" His patience snapped. In a blur of movement, he seized her wrist, his grip firm, unyielding, not rough, not cruel, but possessive, a warning, a promise. He pulled her closer until the heat of his body clashed against her unnatural cold. Celine did not flinch. She only smiled, slow and knowing. His breath was unsteady, his voice rough. "You don't know what you're asking for." Her silver eyes gleamed, reflecting the moonlight. "Then show me." The space between them vanished. His fingers traced the curve of her waist, slow and deliberate, his touch igniting something dark, something neither of them could name. She shivered beneath his hands, the slightest reaction, but enough to send a deep satisfaction curling through his chest. She wasn't unaffected. She wasn't untouchable. She could burn too. Her fingers trailed against his throat, teasing the line of heat pulsing beneath his skin. Her touch was cold, but he welcomed it. Let it sink into him. Let it battle the inferno within. Their breaths mingled, the night pressing in around them, trapping them in a moment that neither of them dared to break. His lips brushed against the curve of her jaw, not quite a kiss, but enough to send a shiver through her. A silent victory, a silent surrender. Celine closed her eyes, as if memorizing the sensation. "I shouldn't want this," she whispered. Rael's voice was a growl, low and rough. "And yet you do." Her lips parted, her breath unsteady. She could deny it, but the truth was already written in the way she leaned into him, in the way her body betrayed the cold logic of her kind. They were past the point of no return. The hunger had consumed them both. The world beyond them had ceased to exist. The trees stood as silent witnesses, their twisted branches reaching toward the heavens, but nothing else moved. The night itself seemed to pulse in anticipation, its breath held in the space between them. Rael could feel this control slipping, piece by piece, undone by the presence of the creature before him. Celine stood in the moonlight, her beauty something unearthly, something carved from darkness and silver dreams. She was a being meant for the stars, untouched by mortal hands, untamed by mortal hearts. Yet here she was, close, too close. Her breath was cool against his skin, her fingers ghosting along the curve of his throat. A touch meant to tease, a touch meant to remind him that she was no ordinary woman, no fragile thing to be handled with care. "I can hear your heart," she whispered, her voice a soft melody wrapped in shadow. "It beats like a war drum." Rael exhaled sharply, his grip tightening where his hands rested against her waist. "Because I am at war," he murmured. Celine tilted her head, her silver eyes gleaming. With me? With myself. She smiled then, slow and knowing, her fingers trailing lower, tracing the ridges of his collarbone. She was testing him, pushing him, tempting the beast that he fought to keep caged. And God's help him, she was winning. He moved, swift and certain, pressing her back against the rough bark of a towering oak. The forest around them seemed to sigh, as if yielding to something inevitable. His body burned, a stark contrast to her icy stillness, but she did not resist him. She did not flinch. Instead, she looked up at him through thick lashes, her lips parting ever so slightly. Daring him. His breath was heavy, uneven, the primal instincts buried deep within him, clawing their way to the surface. You enjoyed this, don't you? He growled, his voice thick with restrained hunger. Her smile deepened, her fingers lifting to tangle in the strands of his dark hair. Does that surprise you? No. His lips hovered near the curve of her jaw, not touching, but near enough that he could feel the coolness of her skin against his heat. But it should. Celine's breath hitched, the smallest reaction, but one that sent fire licking through his veins. She wasn't as untouchable as she wanted him to believe. His grip on her waist tightened, not to restrain, but to remind her she was not the only one who could play this game. I could ruin you, he whispered, his voice edged with dark promise. Celine exhaled a soft, knowing sigh, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, her cool touch a maddening contrast to the inferno raging beneath his skin. And yet, she murmured, you hold back. His jaw clenched. She was right. He was holding back. But for how much longer? Celine shifted, pressing herself against him, the chill of her body sinking into his heat, a wicked contradiction that sent his mind reeling. What are you afraid of, wolf? She whispered. His golden eyes burned as they met hers. That if I give in, he rasped, his lips grazing the corner of her mouth, I'll never stop. The words settled between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Celine's fingers trailed lower, her breath soft against his skin. Then don't. A snarl rumbled from his chest, primal and raw. And as the night deepened, the line between predator and prey blurred, until neither of them knew who was hunting whom. The forest pulsed with an energy neither of them could name. It wrapped around them like a living thing, the air thick with the scent of damp earth, of untamed power, of something far more dangerous, desire left unchecked. Rael's breathing was slow but heavy, the beast within him pacing, restless. His control, once a steel fortress, had thinned to nothing more than a fragile thread. And she, this impossible creature before him, was testing every limit he had left. Celine stood still, yet her presence was a storm. She was carved from shadow and moonlight, her silver eyes unreadable, lips slightly parted as if she had words she dared not speak. The space between them was nearly gone, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. You look at me, she whispered, her voice ablaze laced with silk, as if you're starving. Rael's jaw tensed, golden eyes burning as they roamed over her, this cold, untouchable goddess who had somehow set his world on fire. Because I am. Celine didn't move away. She should have. Any sane creature would have. But she only watched him, her gaze dipping to his mouth before flicking back up. Then why do you hesitate? A growl rumbled deep in his chest, dark and unrestrained. He stepped closer, closing the last breath of space between them, his hand rising to cup the curve of her jaw. Her skin was cold beneath his touch, a cruel contrast to the heat burning through his veins. She was the embodiment of temptation itself, and she knew it. I hesitate, he murmured, voice low, rough, because once I take what's mine, I don't get it back. Celine's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Her stillness was deceptive. He could feel the way her breath caught, the way her fingers curled slightly, betraying the control she was so desperate to maintain. He had spent too long resisting, too long pretending he could stand in her presence and not be undone. No more. His fingers slid lower, tracing the delicate curve of her throat, where no pulse beat beneath the surface. She was immortal, untouchable, but right now she felt real beneath his hands, tangible, breakable. Celine exhaled a breath that could have been a sigh or a warning, but she did not stop him. His mouth hovered near hers, teasing the space between them, the fire and frost of their natures clashing, battling, consuming. "Say it," he whispered, his voice thick with something primal. Celine's fingers trailed up his chest, slow, deliberate, her touch light but deadly. Her eyes met his, unblinking, unwavering. "I am not yours, Wolf." A slow, dangerous smile tugged at Rael's lips. "No." And then he moved, fast, instinctive, pressing her back against the ancient bark of the oak behind her. The tree groaned under the force, but Celine made no sound. She only stared up at him, unshaken, unwavering. But she was breathing harder now. Her lips parted just slightly, her pupils dilating. She was not unaffected. His thumb brushed along her bottom lip, testing, teasing. "Then why do you tremble?" Celine's breath hitched, a fleeting moment of hesitation, and it was enough. Rael leaned in, his mouth near her ear, his breath sending a shiver through her. "I smelled the lie on you." Her fingers curled against his chest, a silent response, a silent surrender. The night whispered around them, but neither of them moved. Neither of them dared to break the spell. The night wrapped around them, thick as velvet, hiding them from the rest of the world. The moon burned high above, casting its silver light across their bodies, one carved from fire and strength, the other sculpted from ice and darkness. Opposites, enemies by nature. And yet they stood tangled in a war neither could win nor wish to escape. Rael could feel her, every breath, every slightest shift, as if his very senses had attuned to her alone. His body was rigid with restraint, muscles taut beneath his heated skin, but his hands refused to let go. Celine was beneath them, cold and unshaken, her silver eyes searching his with something that did not belong to her kind. Desire. It should not have been there, but it was, and it was undoing them both. His fingers slid along the curve of her throat, lingering where no heartbeat pulsed, a reminder of what she was, a warning. But his wolf did not care. Celine's breath ghosted against his lips, a whisper of winter, sending a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the cold. Her fingers, delicate yet deceptively strong, traced the hard lines of his chest, teasing the inferno barely contained beneath his skin. "You burned," she murmured, her voice smooth as dark silk. Rael's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "And you freeze." Celine tilted her head, the faintest amusement flickering in her gaze. "Perhaps that is why we are drawn together." Rael exhaled slowly, his control slipping further. "Or perhaps it's why we'll destroy each other." Her lips parted slightly as if considering his words. Then she moved, too fast, too smooth, until she was the one pressing against him, reversing the game. The tree behind him groaned beneath the sudden shift, the ancient wood protesting under their silent battle for dominance. Rael did not fight her. He let her think she had the power, let her think she had won. But the truth was written in the way she trembled beneath her cold, flawless surface. He saw it, felt it, and he would prove it. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist, twisting her gently but firmly until their roles were reversed once more. She gasped, not in fear but in something deeper, something that made his blood heat. She was strong, but he was stronger. He lowered his mouth to her ear, his breath hot against her frozen skin. "Do you yield?" Celine's breath hitched, but she did not look away. Never. A dark chuckle rumbled from his chest. "Liar." His fingers slid lower, tracing the delicate dip of her spine, igniting something in her that no vampire should feel. Celine's lips parted, a whisper of something unspoken passing between them. Her fingers curled against his chest, but not to push him away. No, she was anchoring herself, as if the force between them was too much for even her to control. Rael felt it too. The pull, the hunger, the undeniable truth that whatever this was, it had already consumed them both. His lips brushed the corner of her mouth. Not a kiss, not yet, but a promise. And this time Celine did not pull away. She did not resist, because the war between them had already been lost, and neither of them wanted to be saved.